since we're all calling in from different parts of the world, I'd like to invite everyone who's here joining us online to participate in a collaborative grounding and land acknowledgement. So Melissa and I are going to facilitate this part together, and I'll pass it over to her to start us off.
Thanks, Tobias, and thanks everyone for being here and for gathering in this way. It's always a joy to open our time together by grounding, connecting with the land, and I like to pretend that we're all coming together in a circle. So yes, we are on Zoom, and over the pandemic, I've been calling Zoom this sacred circle of squares. So maybe pretending that we are all sitting around in a circle where no one's above, no one's below. Instead, we're just at the same level of one another, and therefore we can speak at our heart level. So I want to invite each of us to wiggle around and notice if you could get a little bit more comfortable in this moment. And I'll offer us a grounding and then pass it back to Tobias. And so just welcoming yourself here into this moment, I'll integrate some Cree to say Tansei Kia Wau. Welcome, I hope you're well. And I'm Melissa, I use she, her pronouns as Alyssa shared, and I identify as a Neheo Esqueo, a Cree woman who's a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta. And it's always an honor to have time to open in a mindful way. And this is shifting away from those rote land acknowledgements that often many of us have heard, and to really deepen where we locate ourselves. So you might be happy just as you are, and maybe you'd be comfortable to close your eyes. You might close your eyes or soften your gaze. Maybe you can feel where your body is connecting to the earth and the land below you. Can you feel your feet or your seat? Maybe you can feel support behind you, below you. And maybe just taking a nice big inhale in your own way. Nice big exhale. And inviting each of us to call on the sacred lands and waters that connect each of us across Turtle Island, or North America as we now call it. And these lands have and are continue to be cared for by Indigenous communities, and they've been cared for thousands and thousands of years, longer than we can ever imagine or fathom. And so perhaps taking a moment to consider the land where you are, and where you locate yourself here on Turtle Island or North America. Maybe just taking another nice big inhale. Nice big exhale. I'm grateful to many elders and knowledge keepers and wisdom keepers that I have the privilege of learning from, and who have shared oral history with me that they have somehow maintained in the face of attempted erasure. And so, for example, Mi'kmaq elder and knowledge keeper, Dr. Albert Marshall, is one of the lovely souls who I've had many opportunities to learn from. And Dr. Marshall developed and teaches on this framework that's called Eduaptamak, TwoEyed Seeing. And this framework is how he describes us learning to see from one eye the strengths of Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing, doing, and being, and with the other eye, with the strengths of mainstream knowledge and ways of knowing and doing and being. And Dr. Marshall talks about the practice of using both eyes so that we can benefit all. And this is a practice. So when we really honor Indigenous peoples and ways of knowing, we really are honoring the land. When we honor that we are part of the ecosystem, the earth is our caregiver and offers us everything that we need. Everything that we need. I've heard many times that everything around us has a spirit, is alive, and has a purpose. And that the spirit of the land and our spirit are inseparable. The spirit of the land and our spirit are inseparable. And so here's a little practice that I'll invite us to really ground into this moment before handing it over to Tobias to offer us some reflective questions. Maybe as you're inhaling, imagining that you're inhaling the spirit of the land. And exhale, imagining perhaps that you are exhaling, fusing your spirit with the spirit of the land. Inhaling the spirit of the land. Exhaling and fusing your spirit with the spirit of the land. Spirit of the land and our spirit are inseparable. Over to you, Tobias.
So, as your focus is here on the ground, on the land, Melissa has really helped us connect in a beautiful way. Just invite you, if it feels right, to take a few moments to reflect on the land where your body is situated. And I'll guide us through that with a few questions. So just notice how your attention falls with these questions. Maybe one holds you and you want to explore it, or maybe all of them. So you may think about the people who live on the land that you're on now, or who don't live here. It might feel right to reflect on what you know about the land or what you don't know. Maybe you think about the architecture that surrounds you or the nature. You might think about the Indigenous people who live here currently or who have lived here in the past. Or perhaps you think about the keepers of the land or how the land is treated by the communities who reside here. And while you sit with those questions, if it feels right, I'll share that I'm currently calling in from Treaty 7 territory. And Treaty 7 includes the traditional lands of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And the Blackfoot Confederacy is comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. And the Stoney Nakoda includes the Chiniki, the Bearspaw, and the Wesley First Nations. And Treaty 7 is also home to Métis Nation Region 3. And I'll just pass it back to Melissa.
Thanks, Tobias. So just taking a moment again to notice what's happening for you as we continue moving through this way of honoring and uplifting Indigenous communities, peoples, and lands. And what we're doing right now is honoring that we too are caregivers of the lands where we are located. And so today I'm zooming in from beautiful Portland, Oregon, and And I find it really important and helpful to find out and learn about the Indigenous populations whenever we have the privilege of traveling, which I have not been traveling for a long time, as many of us haven't either. And really, why we do that, it's as a way of really amplifying and uplifting that Indigenous peoples are and have always been here. And so today I'm here and I'm actually in the library of the Multnomah County Library. And I'm grateful to the Chinook bands. And so I'll share with you the names of the Indigenous bands that are in this area, honoring the Cowlitz, the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Tuwalalant, Kalapuya, Wasco, Mulala, Watlala, and Chinook. And honoring that these bands come together by way of the Big River, also known as the Columbia River. And even being mindful of that, it's just knowing that we can continue learning about the places where we are located every day. And the more we do that, the more we become aware of the presence of Indigenous peoples and communities and wisdoms. And so in the spirit of decolonization, my late Uncle Rick and my Auntie Rose have shared with me a guiding principle that offers me support in all of the work that I have the honor to work towards decolonization. And the principle is never about us without us. Never about us without us. And so what's happening right now is exactly that. We're putting into practice the importance of having Indigenous representation and community building within a structure that is dedicated to decolonization. And us co-facilitating a land acknowledgement is an opportunity for us to do this in relationship. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to Tobias, always. And so my heart is called to extend an invitation to each of you to spend time learning about the land where you are and what it means to be a steward and caregiver of the sacred lands, and how making a commitment to these lands means that we're also committing to being stewards, activists, and advocates for Indigenous rights. And this is a challenging journey, and it's a lifelong journey, and requires us to have a willingness to look at ourselves and to honor the importance of creating and maintaining authentic and meaningful relations. So every time that we honor, not just acknowledge, every time we honor Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing, we're decolonizing. And so by celebrating and uplifting Indigenous peoples, voices, communities who are sharing their wisdom, we are decolonizing. So again, just taking a moment to notice where your body is being held by the land without needing to change anything. You might just notice what you notice. And maybe once again, inhaling the spirit of the land and exhaling, infusing your spirit with the spirit of the land. Everything is sacred, the land, the people, the animals, and you. So thank you for joining us in that way, and just bringing yourself back into the space, slowly, mindfully, grabbing anything that you might need, including water. Thanks, Tobias.
Thank you, Melissa. I just feel so much more grounded and present when we start in this way. So deep gratitude and appreciation. I'm going to turn to an opening invitation, another invitation to collaborate and to be here collectively. And this is the first time I've done this in a public talk. So we're going to see how it goes. We're going to see together. This will be the experiment. So before we jump into it, I want to just give a little note on language. So for this talk, I'm going to be using the word trans. I'm going to be using it as an umbrella term for those who identify as two-spirit, transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming. Basically, all those who no longer identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. And I choose this language with a knowledge of its limitations, right? So some examples of its limitations are that not all those placed under that umbrella necessarily identify with the language of trans. Another limitation is that the language of trans can be traced through a colonial history, right? So we use language with an awareness of its limitations and also an openness to changing and growing with it. All right, so I'm gonna use a Jamboard. So I put the Jamboard link in the chat, and I invite everyone to go ahead and open it. Hopefully it's accessible for everyone. And I'm gonna lead us through a series of kind of like reflective or journal prompts. And then we'll turn to the Jamboard. So there'll be 2 guiding questions, and we'll start by just writing. So if you have, a pen and a piece of paper handy, if you want to write maybe on your computer, or if you just want to reflect on these questions as I go through them, and then I'll guide us to the use of the Jamboard. So the first question that I want to pose, and everyone, including the panelists, can engage in this, and our hosts. So the first question is, how would you describe the history of trans research? This is a big question, and I'll guide us through it. So how would you describe the history of trans research? So what comes to mind? Putting that another way, you could ask, how have trans people been studied and written about in the past? Maybe you've noticed the way research has been conducted on trans people in LGBTQS research more broadly. So in other words, what happened to the T and the 2S in LGBTQ2S research? Maybe you could think about who has conducted this research. Has it been trans people or cisgender people? We're talking about the history. So like 10 years ago, maybe even just 5 years ago. What are some of the identities or social positions of the researchers? Or maybe what research questions have been asked? What have past researchers been most interested in regarding trans people? And maybe your answer to all these questions, I don't know, I've never thought about this before, that's why I'm here. Or it could be, I didn't know that trans research had a history. Or maybe you just have a gut feeling, without having read about it. You have a sense. So all of that is really valid in answer to the question, how would you describe the history of trans research? So now we'll turn to the Jamboard. So if you're writing, you can keep writing. Oh, people are already doing it. So yes, pick a word or a sentence, and maybe Alyssa, you can also share it on the screen in the Zoom so that folks can see what's being posted. And I'll add some more notes here. So you can look at what you've written or thought about and pick a word or a short sentence that describes. So we have some really great words here: Eurocentric, eugenic, like the question of what caused being trans, medicalized, problematic, transphobic, exclamation mark, from the perspective of mental illness, limited, pathological, exploitative, lacking, I love suspicious, whoever did that. Nice. Yeah, so great words. Okay, so thank you. So now, if you want to keep adding there, please keep adding. And I'm going to turn to our second question. And this is our dreaming question. This is our co-imagining futures question. And so on the Jamboard at the top, there's this, it says 1/2. And so if you want to turn to the next Jamboard, you can. There's like a little arrow and you can switch over to our next question, which is, what is trans-led trans research? What is trans-led trans research? And so you can go right to the board and write words, or you could start by journaling or thinking, and I'll guide us through some follow-up questions, okay? So put another way, if you could describe what trans research would look like that was based in trans community, how would you describe it? What would it look like? So there's no right answer here. Again, we're just imagining together. What topics would be studied? What questions would be asked? What would be the approach? How would it be different than research led by cis people? And that includes cis members of the LGBT community. What is the future of trans research, especially in response to all the difficulties that we named in the last board? So we have words like collaborative, which is what we're doing right now, transformative, which is a great counter to the suspiciousness of the other research, inclusive, relevant to communities' needs, responsive, transformative. It deconstructs the binary, intersectional, nuance, focuses on trans cultures of the past, present, futures, applied. Community decides what they think should be studied rather than researchers deciding. Accounts for intersex people, affirming gender hormonally and physically. These are so great, strength focused. I'm going to add one that it's joyful. Give people a few more moments. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I would say ultimately that was extremely successful. Thank you all for sharing that beautiful vision, that reflectiveness of what research has been and what it could be. And this is, you know, a big part of how we imagine trans futures and the possibility of trans research. So I'll turn now to the kind of talk portion of our presentation. So I'm going to give, I'll give a little bit of a lecture, and then we'll have Melissa talk for a while, and then we'll end with Juliana, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. Okay. So we can get the PowerPoint started. All right, so I've started us off thinking collectively about the history of trans research to help actively frame the larger conversation about our project, Transgender Mental Health During COVID-19, Digital World Building in Alberta, which is a qualitative community-based research project that began in November 2020. So I'll go through again kind of what we'll be talking through. So I'll start off today by discussing the history of trans research, and then dive into our research design, our preliminary findings, and finally, our upcoming digital storytelling project. From there, I'll pass it over to Dr. Melissa J., who will share insights on our relational and trauma-informed approaches. And then our RA, Juliana, will address identity-based experiences and our super rad upcoming zine, Transcending the Narrative. And then, yes, we'll have time for discussion at the end. So I'd also like to acknowledge and express gratitude for the financial support we got for this research. Athabasca University supported this research through a series of internal grants, including the COVID-19 Special Funds Grant and the Academic Research Fund. All right, so we can change slide. What made you trans? So if you study the history of trans research, this is the question posed over and over again, if of course trans folks are studied at all. So this is a history of academic and medical pathologization, which many of you named really clearly in the Jamboard. And it's one which considered gender nonconformance to be an illness and a symptom of sexual perversion, which, if better understood, if we could answer that question, what made you trans, it could be cured. So the trans psychoanalyst Griffin Hansberry has called this repeated question of trans etiology, or the origin of transness, why trans? The why trans? He argues that the search for the cause of transness is a shield against cisgender anxieties caused by an encounter with difference. So although we certainly see resonance of this kind of pathological approach today, so for example, in debates surrounding conversion therapy, and of course, the heightened scrutiny of trans youth, especially with legislation being passed in the States right now, trans research still is unquestionably growing. However, in much early non-pathologizing writing about trans folks, they were considered only briefly, leaving some queer scholars to argue that the T in LGBTQ research was actually a silent T. Furthermore, as trans people are often marginalized and systemically excluded from academic institutions, much emerging trans-affirming scholarship is continually written by cisgender academics. So this cisgender-led work, in turn, really shapes the types of questions that are being asked, the methodological approaches, and the research outcomes. You can go to the next slide. The emergence of transgender studies has worked to dismantle these really narrow conventions and expand the very notion of legitimate research with, about, or considering trans people. This new budding field has also allowed scholars to ask, what is trans-led trans research? How would our approach differ from legacies of cis-led research? You could perhaps call this a T4T approach, meaning trans for trans. And this is an acronym which first appeared in Craigslist personnels as a public call for trans people seeking other trans people. And there's actually a special issue in the Transgender Studies Quarterly called T4T that's out now. So if you're interested in this, you can read more. And in the context of research, the T4T is certainly a call for trans people to find each other in knowledge production, but also to think through the importance of trans perspectives, unique methodologies, and under-considered orientation. Our current community-based project, Transgender Mental Health During COVID-19, Digital World Building in Alberta, has provided a wonderful opportunity to think through and contribute to these essential shifts in the authorship of trans lives. Okay, you can change slide. This project emerged from the urgency presented by the pandemic in March of 2020. As a trans researcher whose primary focus is on mental health, I was overarchingly interested in the ways that trans folks were being impacted. From its very beginnings, it could be easily assumed that the COVID-19 pandemic would disproportionately harm many marginalized communities, especially those, for example, who worked unreliable or underpaid service jobs, who were houseless or precariously housed, who faced restrictions to competent and unprejudiced healthcare, and those who carry high rates of mental health issues, stigmatization, social rejection, and violence. And so I knew from experience, and again, what we talked about in the Jamboard, that trans people would be underrepresented in research, or perhaps even be misrepresented in LGBTQ research that lacked trans competency. Slide. Many early research endeavors with this populations were quantitative and survey based. So some excellent studies have since been published, including Kidd et al.'s 2021 American Longitudinal Study, which found that the pandemic exacerbated ongoing mental health disparities for trans and non-binary people. They also uncovered that reduced trans support during the pandemic was associated with increased psychological distress. And I find a lot of these findings is really obvious, right? But then we need it to be substantiated in research. So Hawk et al. 2021, they did a cross-sectional survey and found that trans and gender diverse youth face more mental health challenges during COVID-19 than cisgender youth, including more health service disruptions and a distinct lack of support from their families. And then finally, one multinational cross-sectional study from Jarrett et al. 2021 has surveyed trans and non-binary people from 76 countries, and they found reduced access to gender-affirming resources and a reduced ability to live according to gender identity worldwide. Slide. In Canada, Trans Pulse conducted a national online COVID survey, and you can find that all of these studies are accessible, but Trans Pulse is very accessible online. And they found that 37.4% of trans and non-binary people experience an unmet mental health care need despite increased stressors during COVID, while twice as many stopped accessing support groups or health workers. They also found that 1 in 10 had avoided COVID-19 testing or care, of whom 40% indicated this avoidance stemmed from fear of discrimination. Slide. So from the start of the pandemic, I questioned what a trans community-based emergent, intersectional, decolonial, and qualitative project could contribute to the field of knowledge that scholars were just really rapidly mobilizing to produce. And so these often less legitimized approaches are characterized by slowness, by relationship building, by trauma-informed practice, instead of more traditional, expedited, and measurable research outputs. How could our research have an impact? And what impact would be most meaningful to trans people in Alberta who are grappling with COVID in ways not fully yet understood? And while trans people may struggle with disproportionate negative effects of the pandemic, how can we draw upon their pre-established knowledge, the community-based strategies that they already have for surviving difficulty? And this difficulty is already consistently presented by systemic violence and transphobia. Slide. So this project is therefore focused upon making space for things like complexity, resistance, resilience, uncertainty, and ambivalence in trans people's experience of the pandemic, as well as being responsive to community need. In particular, we queried trans people's use of digital world building and technologies of kinship. These digital adaptations, such as the use of social media, online peer support groups, forum information, sharing, and technologies of the body, they really may allow trans people to persevere through acute struggle and uncertainty, and to collectively overcome institutionalized mental health barriers. We were also interested in the limitations or disadvantages of digital worlds. And we really aimed to create a space for the contradicting effects of COVID-19, both positive and negative, in trans people's adaptive online strategies. Slide. We have a strong commitment to decolonial research and Indigenous leadership in our methodology. Our emergent design efforts include creating an Indigenous-centered team, which began through collaboration with Dr. Melissa J., who we've had the opportunity to hear from already, and continued with hiring Two-Spirit consultant Gabe Calderon, as collaborator, as well as working with Two-Spirit organizations such as Edmonton Two-Spirit Society and Two-Spirit in Motion, and also the creation of a Two-Spirit Council. Another part of our commitment to decolonial research practice, again, has been really making space to move slowly, to have conversations, to derail our timelines when necessary, and to give people the opportunity to collaborate in ways that honor their knowledge and expertise, and to practice turning real listening into real action. Slide. We also consistently sought to amplify individuals who carry diverse marginalized identities, including those who are Indigenous, Black, people of color, disabled and neurodivergent people, intersex people, sex workers, working class, poor, houseless, and precariously housed people, those who are HIV positive, and individuals who live rurally. So this intersectional work has been threaded through collaborations of our research team, as well as continued consultation with a trans council. So we had an awesome trans council that was made up of 7 trans-identified Albertans. And all of those council members also held diverse marginalized identities and lived experience. And then of course, we also had our Two-Spirit Council. And then finally, of course, our 30 to 40 in-depth interviews with Two-Spirit, trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people. So our interview participants also held diverse intersecting marginalized identities, various lived experiences. We had age ranging from 15 to 59, and they arrived from locations all over Alberta. Ultimately, we knew that the effects of COVID would be difficult to fully capture with survey-based data alone. And we really aimed to contribute unprecedented findings to a crucial body of scholarship. Most significantly, our goals can only be achieved by centering trans people throughout each step. And that's especially true for multiply marginalized trans people who are often overlooked in research. And so we've completed our interviews with our incredible participants, and we're currently working on our community-based output while the the interviews are being transcribed. And the research zine will be discussed by Juliana later in this talk. So I'll start us off by sharing some preliminary findings from our research based off emerging themes, and also what I think might be some of our boldest contributions to an understanding of the impacts of COVID-19 on trans communities. Slide. All right, so the first finding, without a doubt, our participants encountered increased difficulties with the pandemic, which was found in these quantitative surveys that were done. However, what we found is that there was also a really distinct ambivalence expressed, or a mix of both gendered harms and clear gendered benefits associated with the pandemic for trans Albertans. To give an example, we found that isolation was a significant factor in the increase of depression and anxiety for trans folks. Yet too, many of our participants really articulated feelings of relief in their restriction to the home, especially in relation to their non-conforming gender identities. Some explain that their mental health actually markedly improved with being at home. Many found that in no longer having normalized exposure to ciscentric and transphobic institutions, groups, or individuals, they were able to explore and express their gender identity at home with much greater ease. Some shared stories of isolation, facilitating new discoveries regarding their identity. So one queer, non-binary, Jamaican, Cree, and French Canadian participant explained that while they felt ceremony and spirituality was restricted with COVID, there was also now a new, safer container to explore what made them feel what they called gender euphoric. Quote, "It was like going into a little cocoon," end quote. So participants reported decreased anxiety and no longer getting misgendered or navigating binary gendered spaces like public washrooms. For some, being seen by others in public risks consistent harm through gender misrecognition. But then still for others, we heard being seen in public actually presented a potential for gender affirmation that was sorely missed. Slide. So another notable finding that I can share is that in the face of in-person mental health service disruptions, trans Albertans have created online support and kinship networks in novel and perhaps unexpected places. So participants did report that the expected services shifted to online settings, such as trans-friendly Zoom therapy sessions or trans peer support groups offered at, for example, Calgary's Skipping Stone. However, there was a lot of digital mental health support that came really uniquely, and affirmation arrived in really eccentric areas that also represented the participants' intersecting identities. So many trans Albertans really struggled to balance between offering help to others while also receiving the help that they needed. For example, one white, disabled, non-binary participant regularly attended a university Discord group for queer and trans students, but they reported feeling like, quote, "a fish out of water," end quote, because of their age. They were often acting as a mentor. It was instead within a Facebook cat group that they found a peer, someone who shared the similar experiences that they had around queerness and disability, where they were able to finally receive support. One white, gay, queer, bisexual, trans male participant felt most seen and supported in a channel for majority cisgender straight men who wanted to masturbate with other mostly cisgender straight men. He found that group to be, quote, "a million times more accepting of his transness," end quote. Some participants of color turned to BIPOC-centered groups, even if there was no or very little other queer and trans people present, because they found that queer and trans spaces were very inhospitable in their whiteness. One Christian Nigerian trans male participant shared that, quote, "the feeling of belonging was something evasive," end quote. He was, quote, "too queer, too spiritual, or not spiritual enough," end quote. Yet eventually he found belonging in an online Black church during the pandemic. Similarly, a mixed race, non-binary, and queer participant explained that the pandemic helped them stop drinking through access to an online AA group for Black and mixed race women of color. Yet they found that they, quote, "couldn't relate," end quote, to the queer and trans AA groups. Slide. So there's much more to share, even preliminarily, such as how, as the pandemic increased accessibility for some of our disabled participants in ways that they had long been requesting pre-COVID, or the effects of the pandemic on trans community protest and grief with the murder of George Floyd, or the impacts of COVID on gender affirming surgery, huge impacts on that for trans Albertans. And finally, the results of receiving a living wage was served. For a lot of folks, this was a really novel living wage. And this was especially true for houseless trans participants. And so we really look forward to publishing and sharing these outputs in academic journals, but also, again, we're really prioritizing that community-based output and Jay will talk about that with the zine. So I'll end by returning to our opening question: what is T4T research? And hopefully through this talk that I gave, some themes have emerged. In addition to what we put on the Jamboard, I'll share them now. So slide. T4T research could be inherently decolonial and intersectional. It includes and centers trans voices in every part of the research, especially those that are multiply marginalized. It challenges reductive trans scripts. It prioritizes trans community building and authentic relationship building. It embraces qualitative, arts-based, slow, anti-oppressive, or trauma-informed approaches. It focuses on process and transformation over the output, those journal articles. It makes space for complexity, resistance, resilience, uncertainty, and ambivalence. Slide. So I'll end my part today by sharing, a bit about future research. We're really lucky to be working in collaboration with Revision, the Center for Art and Social Justice at the University of Guelph. And this is an arts-based methodology lab, and they use digital media to open up conversations about systemic injustice. So we've secured a grant that can help us build upon this COVID study. And we have a tentatively titled project called Storytelling Trans Futures. And AU will become a satellite site for a digital methodologies storytelling lab. And this lab is going to bridge the areas of slow scholarship with technology and arts-based social justice. We're going to take a selection of 10 participants from the digital or the Trans Digital World Building in Alberta project. And those folks will have the opportunity to tell their COVID stories, to think about trans histories, and imagine trans futures with digital art and filmmaking. Similar to the community-based zine, these arts-based research outputs, in this case, it's going to be 10 about 3-minute trans-made story videos, will hopefully challenge norms of legitimate knowledge production in university settings. So through these accessible, individual, and collective narrative reinventions, we will open up new internet-based conversations about trans care, trans survival, and trans joy. Thank you very much for listening to my part of the talk, and I'll pass it over to Melissa.
Beautiful. Thanks, Tobias. And everyone, like the digital storytelling workshop is just, it's beautiful. It's really exciting and really excited to see what comes through with that. So next slide, please, Erin. So it is a joy to be part of this research team. My role, I've kind of seen my role as being someone who holds space for the unknown. And how I've been kind of honoring that role is by honoring Edweptimuk, TwoEyed Seeing, that framework that I mentioned in our mindful Indigenous acknowledgement. And so, as I shared earlier, Dr. Albert Marshall, who's Mi'kmaq, he developed this framework really as a way to support us in moving forward in a good way. And what I love about it is that it centers relationality, which I've seen us really being mindful of throughout this research experience and as a research team, centering relationality, which I'll share more on in a moment. And then also centering community care through a trauma-informed lens. And so Dr. Albert Marshall's TwoEyed Seeing, or Edweptimuk, encourages us to continue to grow towards being more inclusive and holistic. And that's holistic with a W. And a holistic approach really does include 4 components: our spiritual component of self, emotional, physical, as well as intellectual. And so this is really how we're integrating our mind, body, spirit, and heart in all that we do. Often these things are extracted from research and academia. And Dr. Marshall also talks about that when we use all four components and when we really center being holistic, then we find that we're in harmony and we experience good health, and then we also can honor relationality. Next slide, please, Erin. So let's define relationality. Really, I like to think of it that we're all interconnected. Even like the land, the spirit, everything around us has a spirit. I like even saying, you know, like the sky, the moon, the rainbow, the four-legged friends that we have, and then the two-legged beings that we know. It's everything is interconnected and working together. And we're all connected to one another, the land, nature, everything, the cosmos. And this supports us in really honoring that it's important for us to be honest and speak truth and live with an open heart. When we remember that we're all interconnected, it reminds us that we all play a part, and supporting us in being present even in the face of hard and difficult conversations. So while all Indigenous peoples and communities are unique in their own way of honoring relationality, it does tend to be a central belief, or there's like commonality in that way. And that Indigenous folks believe that humans are interconnected and in ethical relations with the land, the animals, the plants, the cosmos. And Dr. Marshall talks about the idea that if I see the natural world as sacred, I too am sacred because we are interconnected. And when we honor ourselves as sacred, anything is possible and everything is possible. So Indigenous ways of knowing are relational, they're holistic, as I mentioned with a W. They're non-hierarchical, reciprocal. There's lots of give and take in relations. It's constant balancing our needs with the needs of others. Experiential, it's traditional, and it's revealed because of the interconnectedness. So mainstream knowledge tends to be individualistic, compartmentalized, hierarchical, non-reciprocal, objective. It tends to center science. It's didactic, dualistic. And so really we want to just honor that these are ongoing practices of really practicing relationality and centering that non-hierarchical approach. And very difficult when most research is naturally more of a mainstream. So using both eyes in this way has been really helpful in this project. Next slide, please, Erin. So relationality in this research, it has, as Tobias was sharing, it's been emergent, and we've responded as we've needed to based on centering connection with those that we've been able to partner with, be in community with, to learn from, including those who have shared their stories. We've centered nurturing relationships through reciprocity and inviting involvement as well as accessibility. It really has felt like community building. And so through listening, consultation, and inviting these nurturing relationships beyond this research project, it has created that sense of community. And the councils have been a place to empower that sense of community as central to this work by being in relationship with and learning from, and also compensating well, which is always something that is so important, especially for folks who tend to be often in trans research as well as in Indigenous research, tend to be the subjects and then not receive any compensation. The compensation has been an act of reciprocity. So really grateful for that. Next slide, please, Erin. Good relations are the cornerstone of a trauma-informed approach. And so relationality in research really is trauma-informed because we're centering the relationship and we're centering that sacredness of being required to show up mind, body, spirit, heart, even in the face of difficult conversations. And so this is important in building on what Tobias has shared, that we are mindfully acknowledging our intersecting identities and privilege. We're listening and learning how to effectively respond to the needs of the community with the community, and then also centering community care. And this is only possible when we are present and willing to lean into discomfort, to listen, and to learn from one another. And so recently I had another opportunity to be with Dr. Marshall, and I'm using Dr. Marshall's teachings today just to center us in one framework. And Dr. Marshall talked about indigenization, and I love how he described indigenization is a call for Indigenous peoples to start asking for what we want and need. And he shared that rather than adapting, Indigenous peoples have to take it upon themselves to start asking for what they need. And because this is a trans study with Indigenous, there's trans-led and indigenization happening. This is happening on both levels. So trans folks are asking for what they need and want, and also it's happening with regards to indigenization. And next slide, please. This is my hand with a butterfly that I found on the sidewalk, just to put context on that picture. Because slowly and mindfully, we can nurture good relations. And often mainstream knowledge centers timelines, outcomes, and accomplishments. As Tobias shared, those outcomes tend to be what drive funders and drive projects. And so moving slowly and mindfully is really hard, especially in systems or institutions that do really center timelines. So calling in an Indigenous worldview has really supported us in learning how to slow down and remembering that relationality is central to everything. When we remember that we're all interconnected, we're better able to nurture those good relations, which has been ongoing and is seen as we continue building on what we're learning from the community, and excited about what's to come with the digital storytelling workshops. So the next slide, please. So I just shared here some syllabics for the Cree word kinanaskomatin. And this really means thank you, I'm so grateful to you. And that's my email if anyone wants to reach out with any questions. But I'll pass it over to Juliana, and I'm so grateful to be here with you all.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. That was wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana, and I use they, them pronouns. As I was preparing for this presentation, I wondered what the most useful things would be to share with you all today, and I decided that speaking from my own experience as a queer and trans researcher would be the easiest and most insightful way to frame my discussion. So with that said, today I'm going to be talking about my own experiences in this research, and I'll also talk about the ways we've worked to adapt and respond to trans community needs. These topics will tie into a larger conversation about how our research is contributing to the development and evolution of trans methodologies. After that, I'll share a little bit about our zine, Transcending the Narrative. Next slide, please. So it always feels a little weird to present without actually introducing myself. So just to start off, hey there, me again, Juliana. I'm the research assistant for this project. I am a mixed Japanese and Persian, queer and non-binary soft butch, sapphic, lesbian, etc., etc. I identify as disabled, neurodivergent, and I grew up in a single-parent, low-income family. For my research background, I did an honors psychology and generative studies degree right here at McEwen. So thank you for having me back. It's nice to see some familiar faces here. And I appreciate the opportunity to return and kind of share what I've been up to since graduating last summer. Next slide, please. So the reason I share my identities is because they significantly impacted my experiences as a trans undergraduate student, both in terms of conducting as well as participating in research. These experiences ultimately influenced how I came into this project and how I started to conceptualize what trans research and trans methodologies could look like. some of the biggest ways that my identity impacted conducting research was that, honestly, I had to deal with a lot of transphobia during my studies. So like I mentioned, I did a psychology and gender studies degree. And what I found that was in my gender studies classes, I would have these moments of refuge almost, where I felt safe and seen, and like I could engage in like discussions and dialogues about things that were truly relevant and impactful to me. Whereas in my psych courses, the level of competency about queer and trans issues was often quite limited. So I had to deal with like just a lot of microaggressions, a lot of misgendering, logistical things like not having access to gender neutral washrooms. I remember I had a class in building 11 on the 4th floor. So I'd have to go down like 2 flights of stairs to the headway level and then like book it across campus to, at the time, I think it was all the way to building 6. There was like a sneaky side bathroom between building 6 and 7 that I would go to. And like Tobias, Melissa, I don't know if you've ever physically been to McEwen, but essentially it was like a cross country trek. I was getting in some serious trans cardio. But while those types of things were certainly inconvenient, the most difficult barrier I had by far was the alienation I felt from my peers and my mentors. When I was misgendered, I was constantly being reminded that the people around me in my program weren't really seeing or respecting me for who I was, and that made it really difficult to connect. After a certain point, I just felt so worn down that I withdrew, and I decided to make myself smaller so that the instances of transphobia wouldn't feel so big. I have distinct memories of visiting my gender studies profs during their office hours and just asking like, does this ever get easier? Can a little mixed queer, like non-binary person like me actually sustain themselves in academia? Because at the time, it just really felt, so impossible. Next slide, please. So those were the things that were coming up for me when I was conducting research. But as far as my experience participating in research, I had a lot of the same issues. But the most notable one for me is what I call the dreaded survey box. So as a psych student, I would have to do all these mandatory research participations for my degree. And they would always start with like these awful demographic questions where they'd ask you about some like huge aspect of your identity and they'd only give you 4 checkboxes to choose from. So for example, they'd ask about race and the answers would be like white, Black, Asian, Middle Eastern, other. And just ignoring for a second how limited those options are, as a mixed person, it would always be like, I don't know, like it's too early in the morning for like this kind of identity crisis. Should I pick Asian? Should I pick Middle Eastern? Technically the Middle East is part of Asia, but then like, why would they split it up like that? Should I pick other? I would genuinely not know what to select. So I just end up making a random choice so I could move on. Of course, the questions about gender would be just as reductive. So again, I just had to pick a random answer so that I could move along with the survey. Now, I always thought this situation was kind of ironic because in my psychology classes, we are always talking about bias and we're always talking about not skewing the data. Yet in these studies, I was constantly forced to pick arbitrary answers because there were simply no suitable options. The way those studies were written and designed literally left no room for my experiences. So how could my data possibly have been useful? Or how could my data possibly have been accurate? Next slide, please. So I share these examples because those experiences really made me wonder, what could trans affirming research look like? What would it have felt like to be seen and respected in those studies? What would it have felt like to be valued and to contribute to research without having to dampen or stamp out parts of my identity along the way? These were the questions I was asking then, and they're also the questions that I continue to ask now as we work through our research project and begin to create our own trans methodologies. At the end of the day, my goal for our participants is to feel like this research is reflective of the things they've experienced, that it's useful for the communities that they're part of, and that it honors the stories they shared with us. To me, those have been the guiding principles of our trans research process. Next slide, please. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about some of the tangible ways we've worked to include trans community and trans wisdoms into our research design. So one way is that we created 2 research councils. The first council was a Two-Spirit Advisory Council with Elder Blue Waters, Cheyenne Miku Kiu, Dr. Melissa J, and Gabe Calderon. What came out of those council meetings was an establishment of what Two-Spirit means for the context of this research, how to support Two-Spirit participants, as well as how to ensure we are minimizing harms from Western academia, colonial institutions, and the research process itself. In addition, 2 of the suggestions that we received from the Two-Spirit Council was to ensure that Indigenous participants received traditional medicines, and that we offered personal development support for the stories and truths they were willing to share with us. So what that ended up looking like was a letter of attestation, where we explicitly named that the participant contributed to our study. This could be used on a resume or as a reference letter, and it ensured that participants were being directly credited with the expertise they were offering us. Next slide, please. So the second council we formed was the Trans Research Council. Much like the Two-Spirit Council, the Trans Research Council is something we added in during the early stages of planning. Part of our methodology is emergent design, and the council is a direct reflection of that. Like, we didn't have a plan to have all these trans councils and Two-Spirit councils at the start of our project, but it's something that just came about really naturally as we started prioritizing the diverse and expansive experiences of trans people. Our lovely council members do amazing community work in various ways, and they each bring so much unique knowledge and expertise to this research. Each council member has a set chunk of hours that they're able to use flexibly on kind of whatever aspects of the project they want to. So some examples of how they've used those hours are creating amazing trans lit reviews, helping with social media, coming up with ways to disseminate our research into the community, and even helping with participant interviews. What's been so wonderful is that each member has a different set of experiences and community work that they draw from. So we're finding ourselves in situations where everyone is kind of skill sharing and supporting each other in learning new things. It's a very reciprocal process. So for example, some of our council members are new to working in academic settings. So we're able to support them in building those skills, while they're also supporting us in making sure that our academic work doesn't become inaccessible to the trans community more broadly. Next slide, please. So this is just a small sample of ways that the councils have contributed to the project, but one other aspect that I'm super grateful for is the impact the councils have had on me as a trans person. It's been so lovely to create community connections with fellow gender diverse people. And I feel that we don't often talk about the effects the research process has on the researchers themselves. I can say that it feels very unique in terms of my own research experience, that while investigating trans mental health, I'm also seeing the ways that this process is having a positive impact on my own trans mental health. Next slide, please. So all in all, what I'm seeing so far from this research is that trans connection, trans kinship, and trans joy are integral aspects of trans methodology. I can't wait to see how we can cultivate these aspects more as the field continues to emerge and evolve. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to leave you with today is something that I'm super thrilled to share. Early on in our research planning, we heard a great deal of community excitement for creating a zine for this project. So for those who don't know, zine is short for magazine, and it's often an informal and self-published document used to share information. So I've been the lead on this project, and collaboratively with Jay Heber, who's also a student here at MacEwan, as well as contributions from GE and Bea Dare from our research council, I'm happy to introduce, next slide please, Transcending the Narrative, Quotes from Two-Spirit, Trans, Non-Binary, and Gender Non-Conforming People During COVID-19. So the zine is going to be completed at the end of the month. So for now, this is just kind of a sneak peek, but you'll be able to find more information on our social media accounts. Thank you. Sorry, I'm seeing the chat. Beautiful cover. Thank you. You'll be able to find more on our social medias, which will be shared at the end of this presentation. As we know, academic papers can take a long time to publish, so the zine acts as a bridge for sharing preliminary findings from our study in a community-friendly and accessible format. The zine is made up from a compilation of quotes from each participant's interview, which is an idea that I had quite early on in the process. Because I noticed when writing academic papers, it's not always possible to include direct information from each person, so I wanted to give participants something they could clearly look back on and find themselves in. Every participant has at least one quote in the zine, and the zine is split into 3 sections, which highlight the most prominent and recurring topics in our study. Next slide, please. So the first section is restriction, which of course, in the context of the pandemic, we've all talked about a lot. But findings in this section include things like difficulties accessing gender-affirming treatment during COVID, the loss of support networks, as well as increases in violence against trans folks, particularly those who are Black and Asian. So in the slide there, sorry, it's very small for me, but it says, this quote says, "I remember the first day COVID hit. My friends and I were kind of talking about it and we're like, oh, we'll get 2 weeks off from school. That's amazing." That was at the end of grade 9 and we just never went back. Next slide, please. The second section is refuge/reconnection. So this was something that came up a lot in our interviews. Trans folks expressed that the pandemic offered them a space away from cis-hetero norms and allowed them to figure out what their identity was and what they found affirming. So one participant compared COVID isolation to a cocoon, where they had done all this growing and changing and metamorphosis, and they were ready for the world to open up and to step out and to share their wonderful transformation with everyone. So one example I used was, we actually really enjoyed being able to get together. Sorry, it's so small for me. What does it say?
We actually want.
Okay, thank you.
We actually really enjoyed like not being able to get together with people anymore. I'm an introvert. I get social anxiety. If it wasn't for the pandemic, I don't think I would have shared any of my music because my first video that I posted on YouTube was during the pandemic.
Perfect. Thank you. Next slide, please. So lastly, we have resistance/resilience. So our participants shared so many stories of strength and community and kinship and trans wisdoms. So this section is where we decided to house all of those beautiful and brilliant quotes. So participants talked about activism during COVID-19. They talked about disability. They talked about creating channels of support with one another, as well as reflecting on tools they developed from being trans that actually helped them make it through the pandemic. So the quote here, "With being trans, 99% of the time, there's always something to look forward to. Even if it's surgery, hormones, a new shirt, whatever, there's always something to look forward to." Next slide, please. Okay, so like I said, this is just a sneak peek for now. I wish I could show you more, but I'm so excited for you all to see the final zine, which will be published at the end of the month. Physical copies of the zine will be available at Glass Bookshop, and we'll also have digital copies available online. But if you want more information about the zine, as well as our other projects, keep an eye out on our social media, or feel free to contact us through email. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. Thank you all so much for your time and energy. It's been so lovely to be here. To wrap up, I will leave you with one of the interview quotes that inspired the title of the zine. "People say ancestors' wildest dreams, but I think I embody my own wildest dreams. My ancestors did not expect this of me. I feel like I'm transcending daily. Sachin Leishi." All right, thank you. Next slide, please. That just has like all our contact stuff. Perfect. Thank you all so much for listening. That concludes our presentation portion of this. So I think we're going to pass it over and start our Q&A. Thank you.